We don't have the amount of time I'd like us to have, but it's an opportunity for me to introduce you to a friend and tell you a little bit about her. We'll cover what Tina's, how we met, what Tina's been up to in her career, which has been nothing short of amazing. Then I'd like to talk a little bit about what you're doing now, particularly at USC. Really interesting stuff there. And then we had a chance to chat and catch up a few weeks ago, and you made a big change at 1-800-Flowers in terms of what we should be emphasizing from a technology point of view, and I'd like you to share your thoughts on that going forward. So, starting back at the beginning, Tina's the first person I ever heard use the term social media, and it was back in the early 1990s. And it just, you hear something and it just catches you at a moment and causes you to think differently, and you caused me to think differently a bunch of times, but in particular, I remember that time. Back, Tina was one of the co-founders of a company called iVillage. And the other term she got me thinking differently about back in those days, especially when you went over to and built Baby Center at AOL, was you thought me to think differently about the word community. Community for me was a physical place in my mind back then. And Tina taught us to think about community as a vertical community, horizontal community, communities of interest. So the amazing things you did back then, give us a little color on your career from how you became one of the top 50 people in technology for all these years.
Luck. I would say I'd rather be lucky than smart is always the best answer to that
question.
Well,
you got it both covered now.
So, well, I don't know about that, but thank you. Such a privilege. Just being here at Techonomy, being here in Sonoma, being back with really old friends, and meeting extraordinary new ones, and being inspired by even how we went out before lunch, before the break. He's spectacular.
Every conversation here is interesting.
It's just amazing. And I have the privilege of sitting on, as you know, the National Board of PBS, where it's such a privilege to serve, and seeing young musicians, young voices.
Speaking of young musicians, how about this Black Box?
That's what I'm talking about. I mean, he's amazing, and just like another shout out to him.
Tonight.
It's just so energizing to see the arts hearkening back, in many ways, back to the future of real talent and disruptors in every area. We can't just think about disruption in technology. So I've spent my career, as you know, as an entrepreneur, building lots of companies I've had the privilege to lead.
You've been an entrepreneur, you've been an entrepreneur?
I've been an entrepreneur, going into large organizations like Johnson & Johnson, like AOL Time Warner, and either turning around businesses or helping scale businesses or driving change within those organizations. So being an entrepreneur in some ways is even more important because the scale you can get on the ground if you really want to make big impact and big change. And then also being a very active investor, both at funds and sitting on boards, as well as an active angel myself and an advisor and board member. And now I'm doing what I think is my purpose, which is I get to be on faculty at USC at the Iovine and Young Academy when Jimmy Iovine and Dr. Dre sold Beats to Apple.
So Young is AKA Dr. Dre. They
Dre.
sell Beats to Apple for $1.75, I think it was. And it gave you a big chunk of money to go build a different kind of school at USC.
Well, it wasn't me, it was USC.
Well,
and I came to it late, so I just want to be very clear.
I'll be the judge of this.
No, just to be clear. But they came to USC just less than 10-ish years ago. Yep. And they challenged USC to kind of manifest an academy that was both a business school, an art school, a culture school, a technology school, a product design school. And they came up with this academy. And this academy was started with cohort 1, less than 10 years ago. And now there's a grad school and a high school.
The high school is the new part, I guess, huh?
Yeah, charter school.
But I mean, from your career, from the perspective of your career, having been in business, having been an entrepreneur, now doing a lot of board work, advising companies, as you say, a lot of personal investing, a lot of fund investing. You seem perfectly suited to be in the role you're in now. And now you're still doing a lot of board work. Mm-hmm. You mentioned PBS, some public company boards. Tell me how your role now has evolved here at USC. What goes on? I remember you started with because back to community.
Yes, so I started with a class.
As important as
community is serious business. Let me just state that for the record. It's not something that's an afterthought. It's truly, you used to think about your go-to-market strategy. I would challenge every leader, every marketer, every founder to think about what your go-to-community strategy is. because community is not about your comments in Instagram. It's not about how many people follow you on Twitter. It's truly about building products, services, and experiences that exist to serve the people that you serve, and they're all your stakeholders. They all have a seat at your table, and there's both an art and a science to that brand trust and that brand truth and that brand engagement.
And do you see the impact of them working in a community, those students, in terms of how they develop, how
Yes.
free-thinking they are? Because you said you get some unusual kinds of kids in this program.
Incredible kids. So basically, one of the classes that I'm teaching now, or starting in January, is called the Web3 and Community Playbook for Brands and Businesses. So in the beginning of the semester, I have my students pick real companies that exist in the world, public or private, and they do a SWOT, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, based on the playbook that I've written and that framework. So take a lens and think about Netflix in a different way, think about Peloton in a different way, think about Figma in a different way, and tell me what their opportunities are, where they're strong, et cetera. So learn it. Then in the second half of the semester, I challenge them on their teams to start companies.
How big are the teams?
Teams are, 3 to 4 people maximum, maybe 5, but not usually.
And a total cohort.
Yeah, total cohort's 30, and then we try and have, roughly 8 to 10 teams, and often made up of undergrad and grad, which is really important. I say, don't worry about the funding and the factories and hiring the people. Let's pretend that just happened. That's a different class we can teach another time.
Yep.
This is like, what is your purpose? What is your mission? Why do you exist in this world? And then what's your go-to community strategy? And then how are you going to scale it? So present me your company as if. And they've come up with the most remarkable things.
Tina, we've heard a lot over the course of the 24 hours about companies having purpose. Do any of your students, when you say you have to figure out what your purpose is and tell me how you got to it, did any of them say, what do we need a purpose for?
They do, but then we teach that. So we teach them to understand, okay, what's your vision, mission, strategy? What's your go-to-market? All of that. But like underneath all of that, like what's your purpose? Why do you exist in the world? And how do your employees, how do your customers, how do your stakeholders, your suppliers, and the communities where you exist begin to understand your presence and why you exist in the world and what are you doing for them? And that does not mean go off and start a 501c3, although that's fine too, but that's like you can have purpose and meaning inside of a very vibrant and profitable company. Profit and purpose can live harmoniously and usually drive outperformance. So employees are more engaged, profits are higher, longitude to retention of talent, attracting more talent. If you think about Gen Z and you think about Gen Alpha, and we'll get more into Gen Alpha in a minute.
By the way, I didn't know there was a Gen Alpha until yesterday. Every time I hang around with Tina, I get a little smarter. And by the way, I've been working with her sister, Lisa, for about a year and a half now. And finally, I said to her, Lisa, is there any chance you're related to a Tina Sharkey? They're sisters. I can't imagine your poor parents, what they went through.
My awesome parents. Yes. That was with Lisa. I was the easy one. But I would say that the thing that is so interesting is that
everyone is shocked that you two grew up in New York. We would never have guessed that.
Never, ever, ever. But I've lived in California for over a dozen years, so there you go.
She lives in a beautiful place. We drove past on the way from the airport.
In Mill Valley, yes. 45 minutes south. You're all welcome to stop in on your way back to SFO. So the thing that's so interesting is that they want purpose. I mean, starting with the talk last night when we heard from John and Esther, and we heard about what does it mean to have real purpose in your work, and then the 30,000 kids that were taking that class versus the small cohorts of 5 to 8, and what are the incentives? And incentives don't have to always be financial. Incentives can have purpose at its core. And I think what we heard last night is like, it's an incentive system. How do you incent people to engage? How do you incent people?
Jimmy and Dr. Dre, did they have that as part of their build a business mentality?
I think their idea, I think their idea was, and again, I wasn't there when the Academy was founded, but when they had Beats at Apple, they had a really hard time hiring people that understood both digital, entrepreneurship, business innovation and disruption, culture and arts. and product design. I mean, think about that in that company at that time. So I think they really wanted to help create a cohort of students that would be not getting to industry after they graduated, but the intersectionality of what does it mean to be engaged with industry and disruption and innovation while you're still there? What does it mean to build while you're still there? How do you learn all these things, and how is it porous to the industries around you? And so that's been really exciting to see the students that are attracted to that and what they're building and what they're doing.
You were mentioning the uniqueness of this program at USC is that you already have a business school, you already have these other schools, and this sort of fits in between. But what you said is the young people who are involved in this program get the best of two worlds, of being a big part of a big university which has sports program and a brand and all those other things, and then within that they have this very unique small school experience.
It's a jewel of a startup for sure, and many of our students are starting companies and staying in school, and so we'll be doing showcases for their startups, helping them get funded, helping them meet the right kinds of people, get the spotlighting. And so I started a conference there last spring called the Tokenization of Everything, really not only bringing in the Web3 conversations around arts, culture, technology, but also spotlighting Trojan projects, because there's so much happening across the campus that it's really remarkable.
And tell us, when you've heard here over the last day or so about the new, will the metaverse, how will it impact us? How will it evolve? Hearing about how a lot can happen just in a 2D world. How do you react to that when you think of what your students are doing and how they're approaching the next technologies?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think that the benefit of being, a freshman, a sophomore, a junior in college is that you really can play the long game. And so I think the metaverse is absolutely here to stay. I agree so much with what we heard earlier that right now one of the greatest applications, and probably will be one of the greatest applications of the metaverse, will be enterprise. Because the transparency that the blockchain can provide, the 3D simulations. I mean, there are winemakers that are putting all of their wines and tokenizing them on the blockchain. De Beers is putting their diamonds on the blockchain. The transparency, the ability, the traceability, understanding simulations for supply chains with geopolitical factors and weather factors and currency factors and all the things we're seeing with countries and how they're interacting, both positively and negatively. All of that can be dynamically simulated inside of the metaverse. And so I think the extensibility for that, both in enterprise and in consumer over time. I also think when I talk about the tokenization of everything, it's really about loyalty. It's about building ongoing relationships. So once you have, let's say, an NFT, it's not just about a JPEG, it's actually about a relationship where you can continual drop things, reward people for engagement, give people first looks, the application in the music business for loyalty and fans and things like that. I mean, we're not even in day one.
So you mentioned that you could micro incent people for engagement. You were so early to the idea of engagement. How would you encourage companies that are consumer-facing to think about engagement today?
Well, I would think about, in the old days, we would talk about, the purchase funnel, and it looked like this. So it was like awareness here, conversion here, next. And I would say that the loyalty love loop, which is an infinity loop, if I was to draw it, that relationships begin after the sale. That true relationships, if a brand is not what you say about your company or your product, a brand is really what a friend tells a friend. And so in order to architect that authenticity, then how do you make sure that friends are incented to share stories? How do you make sure that friends are incented to share their experiences? How do you unlock that, not just the virality, because I'm not talking about campaigns going viral, although that too, but true, authentic endorsement from people who've used your product, who've shared your product, that have had an experience with your product and with your service, and that you're seeing them as people. Because I think that the language of relationships, the language of love, has been in the private sphere, it's about intimacy, and Cornel West says that the language of love in the public sphere is justice. So what is the language of love in the enterprise sphere? If your stakeholders, your customers, your employees, your constituencies in the communities believe they have a seat at your table, because there's been so much trust that has been eroded with governments and institutions. And so business leaders are now filling a lot of those voids. You heard earlier about Mark Benioff getting on the phone to be an advocate for that change. You know, you hear about Microsoft, you know, in the advocacy that they're doing, not just for their employees and for their software and for their products, but for their communities at large. Yep. And that is the expectation of today's leader. You heard it at Autodesk, and we could go on and on. Leaders have to fill that void, because guess what? Your employees believe they have a seat at your table, and so do your customers. So make room for them at your table, and be in community with them, be in relationship with them, and be as better a listener than a speaker. I love what Autodesk had to say about asking questions.
Yep. Going back, you said the relationship begins after the transaction. Couldn't it be you have an engagement and it may never result in a transaction, and that's okay?
That's okay. That's 100% okay.
Yeah.
But it's that relationship. If the transaction, so as you know, I send my aunt the birthday flower cake. So it's one of my favorite 1-800-Flower gifts, and I send it to her every single year.
Could you say that again?
My Aunt Barbara in Boca Raton, Florida, looks forward to getting your birthday cake every year, which is made out of flowers. And I don't know whether or not she's ordered 1-800-Flowers. I'm sure she has. But I can tell you that all the ladies in the card room and all the ladies in the pro shop know all about that cake. Yep. And she talks about it incessantly and she looks forward to it. And so you have a relationship with her, even if she's not buying from you. Yep. And she is like your frontline advocate, even though you may not know her.
Well, the other end of the spectrum from your aunt is this group you call Generation A, Alpha. I didn't know, I was wondering recently, as a matter of fact, what happens after Z? And you, like so many things, are there early. But you also said that you admonished me to make sure we're paying attention as a company at Flowers to how people are going to want to interact with us, the user interface. A little bit about that, and how does it particularly impact this generation Alpha?
Yes, so this is one of the oldest technologies in the entire world. Everyone has heard of it, and it's called voice. So voice, we were joking, if you remember the movie The Graduate, and somebody whispered to Dustin Hoffman, when he was graduating from college, what is the thing to focus on? And it was plastics. If anyone asked you that question today, or they asked me that question, I would say voice. Voice is the most disruptive, transformative technology that we're going to see for a very long time. Why? Well, first of all, hundreds of millions of audio devices are in our homes. And so between Alexa, Google, Siri, Xfinity, because you're talking into your remote, and countless other devices, we have a massive database of voice. But that voice is based on time of day, interest and pursuit, mood, so sentiment analysis is in that voice, and device. And so this generation will be the first generation, Generation Alpha, Generation Audio, as I've rebranded them, to have grown up with voice devices in their homes. And
I see my 4-year-old grandson. He interacts with a voice device all day long.
And here's the interesting thing is that the fastest growing users of voice are 12 and under and 65 and above at the same rates. We've never seen that before, but you have to think about the user interface, right? The user interface of voice is voice. So you don't have to be on a screen. You don't have to know the UI or UX. The accessibility of voice is universal. And so at a minimum, as a purpose-driven platform, accessibility, and I used to run AOL's networks and AIM and ICQ and all of that, and accessibility was such a priority, and it still is for everyone. So that's at a minimum. Now go into all the voice in customer service files. So when you get thrown into a phone tree, you want to be in conversational AI. So think about conversational AI. There might be 500,000 phone calls that come into your voice, into your customer service banks. But at the end of the day, if you reduce that, it's probably 50 conversations. And so if you can reduce that to 50 scripts, and then if you're not meeting the need after that, then flip them over to a customer service representative who can then intervene. So thinking about mood, thinking about time of day, and then think about the cordless generation. So what does the cordless generation mean? How many people here have cut their cable cords? Okay, so if you cut that cord, that means you're probably streaming. And that means you're going to Netflix or Hulu or Amazon or some other service. So there's no guide. I mean, for those of you here who remember must-see TV, the NBC lineup of Friends and Seinfeld and all that, that's gone. The art of programming is gone if you don't have a cord and there's no guide. You're basically asking. So you're like, I'd like to see a romantic comedy about da-da-da-da. And so then you're using voice to navigate.
It makes all the sense in the world, and after you told us, reminded me how important it is, we met with our tech team, and it just makes all the sense in the world. We're all excited about people using our chat and being more effective there, but that's a type-to-script chat, and I find myself getting annoyed now if there isn't a good voice interface. So I think, like so many things, Tina, you just say it a little different, you coin it a little different, you explain it a little different, and I'm going to leave here saying, voice is the future. Thanks, Tina.
Thank you. Such a pleasure.